Welcome, everyone, to the opening event of the 2014 Emerson-Wier Symposium. We're delighted to see you. I'm Shelley Reese. I teach English here. Our focus for the symposium this year, the intersections between science and the arts, is particularly dear to me, as I've vacillated wildly between biology and literature myself before settling on the English major. And there are more of us out here than you might think. Tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Eric Kandel, argues that the best scholarship in every field necessitates digging beneath surfaces to excavate meaning. And indeed, one can explicate an organism and dissect a poem, as well as vice versa, as explicators and dissectors are, in a very real sense, asking the same questions. At the very least, by the end of the day, we should all discover more reasons to think about the communion between disciplines instead of the disunion. The panel discussion element of the USAO Spring Symposium complements and supplements the international context of the keynote presentation by assembling scholars from Oklahoma and our neighbor states whose research exemplifies the ways in which the featured ideas invigorate local intellectual communities. Our first speaker for the afternoon, Dr. Shannon Spaulding, is an assistant professor of philosophy at OSU, studying philosophy of mind, philosophical psychology, and philosophy of science, with a goal toward constructing a philosophically and empirically plausible account of social cognition. Dr. Spaulding's recent presentations include a talk titled Rationality and Desire in Fiction, which I totally want to read, delivered to the American Philosophical Association Central Division in Chicago, and she'll be making further presentations this year in Germany and London. Dr. Spaulding's work also appears in Handbook of Embodied Cognition, Mind and Language, Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences, and Philosophical Psychology. Her talk today addresses many connections between science and philosophy.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the relationship between philosophy and science. In our culture, philosophy generally is perceived as useless and a waste of time. In my comments here, I'm going to focus on the usefulness of philosophy. I'm going to argue that philosophy is useful for science. Moreover, stronger, this interaction between philosophy of science is both necessary and mutually beneficial for philosophers and scientists. Okay, so why do I think that? Well, often philosophers and scientists are asking the same sorts of questions. They're asking questions about human nature, about the universe, about our role in the universe. Though scientists and philosophers are asking the same sorts of questions, they bring to bear different resources for answering these questions. Slide 2. Okay, so philosophers are trained in conceptual clarity, in understanding how the pieces of a puzzle fit together, and answering big picture questions such as what exists, what can we know, and what is valuable. Using rigorous conceptual analysis, we try to figure out the best way to understand a phenomenon and what implications this has for the way that we conceptualize the world. So Wilfrid Sellars offers a general description of what philosophers do. It's vague, but I think it accurately captures what we're trying to do. Here's what he says. The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. That's generally what philosophers are trying to do. In contrast, scientists bring a different set of skills to the table. Scientists are trained in experimental design and data gathering and mathematical analysis of data. They focus on testing precise empirical claims. Moreover, scientists' familiarity with the existing empirical evidence puts them in a better position to judge what we know and do not know about the empirical world. So given that philosophers and scientists often are asking the same sorts of questions, but bring to bear different resources for answering these questions, it stands to reason that combining forces can be mutually beneficial. My area of research is philosophy of cognitive science. So I focus mostly on social cognition, which very basically is our ability to understand and interact with other people. And all sorts of ordinary circumstances every day, we understand and interact with other people, driving on a busy freeway, engaging in a debate, following politics, gossiping, playing sports. These are examples of social cognition. The goal of my research is to understand how social cognition works, what happens when it breaks down, and most importantly, the cognitive architecture that makes our social cognition possible. Theories about social cognition are shaped by philosophical considerations, empirical evidence, including developmental psychology studies and cognitive neuroscience. Importantly, philosophers and psychologists not only are engaged in each other's research, that is, sort of citing philosophers' work and psychologists' work, but they're also collaborating with each other. Philosophers and scientists are writing papers together, they're running experiments together. And the result is, in my view, mutually beneficial. I think that we have, as a result, a better and deeper understanding of social cognition.
Next, we have Dr. Sarah Tracy, an associate professor in the University of Oklahoma Honors College and director of the university's Medical Humanities program, which in cooperation with the OU College of Medicine offers a minor in medical humanities and an 8-year combined BA-MD medical humanities scholars program.
So I'm going to begin my presentation today with a very inclusive definition of the medical humanities. And it includes not only the arts and letters, which I think most people would describe as the humanities, but we also talk about the social sciences as being part of the medical humanities approach that we take at the University of Oklahoma. And you can see there that philosophy and ethics figure prominently, so Dr. Spaulding should be pleased. And as I was listening to her talk, I also noticed that there's so many commonalities between what you had to say, Dr. Spaulding, and the sociology of science, the courses that I often teach. So there are some working assumptions within our program, and one of the first is that the humanities and arts provide insight into the human condition. I don't think you'd have many people object to that. The humanities, the arts, the letters teach us about joy, love, sadness, the human experience, suffering during war and peace, personhood in many senses of the word, familial, political, and existential, our responsibilities to each other, to our nation, to ourselves, to our families, future generations, and that these things really, over time, give us different perspectives on disease, health, and the medical the practice of medicine. But we also have some other assumptions that we work with, and they include that literature and arts help to cultivate skills of observation, whether those skills are visual or oral. They help develop our powers of analysis and communication. They may stimulate empathy, we hope they do, and self-reflection. And all of these abilities and skills, I think you would probably agree, are really important to delivering humane and effective care. So how does culture shape the individual experience of illness is another thing that we look at in sociology of medicine, in medical anthropology, and how do different cultures, whether it's popular culture, ethnic cultures, political, institutional, how do they influence the way medicine is practiced? So we had some pretty lofty goals when we started our program, and they were essentially to develop well-rounded, compassionate, empathic physicians, people who would be comfortable in the multicultural clinical context that is just about everywhere these days, individuals who'd also be capable of self-reflection. We wanted to cultivate systemic thinking, so to create physicians who would look at a particular individual clinical case, but who might connect it to larger social issues, social infrastructure, politics. So what some might call non-compliance, if you realize that your non-compliant patient was actually not that affluent and might not have a car, and this is often the case in Oklahoma, that if you don't have a car, it's really hard to get around. I came from the East Coast to Oklahoma back in 1999, and I wondered, how did students get around? How would they go from the Norman campus to the Oklahoma City campus? Coming from the East Coast, my assumption was there must be some public transportation or shuttle service. Why no, they all drove. So there are different things that we have to factor into the diseases people get. And this, the systemic thinking is really big picture thinking, like Dr. Spaulding was talking about moments ago. We wanted to train caregivers also who would continue their passion for lifelong learning, individuals to keep that flame of idealism alive, because young people enter medicine, but the pre-medical curriculum and the medical school curriculum sort of beat the humanity out of them, the idealism out of them when they have to get a particular grade on the organic chemistry test, or they're focused entirely on the MCAT, they may lose perspective. And so we wanted to keep that flame alive and honestly just make pre-medical education and even medical school more fun. So once we recruit the students, what sort of experience do they get? There are two parts to our program. One is the Medical Humanities minor. The other is the Medical Humanities Scholars Program. The minor is open to anyone who has an honors grade point average. They take 6 courses or 18 credit hours of work in the medical humanities. They design their own curriculum, and we emphasize foreign spoken language and exposure to non-Western culture through their coursework as well. The Medical Humanities Scholars Program is the 8-year program, the BA-MD program. Students are admitted from high school. There's a rigorous admissions and selection process. They receive provisional acceptance at OU College of Medicine when they're admitted into the program. They do the minor, and they also have a sort of value-added curriculum which involves mentorships, community service, art, travel abroad, shadowing of physicians and non-physicians. So say an acupuncturist or a physical therapist, so they become used to working in teams. There are several options for medical students once they get to the College of Medicine, and you can see that there are these courses. Jerry Veneta helped overhaul the curriculum in 2010, and he made these electives in the medical humanities required for all medical students. So they take 16 contact hours, which actually is a fair bit in medical school, and they can choose to study literature in medicine, art in medicine, spirituality in medicine, history of medicine. I teach the history of medicine and the women in medicine courses, and I teach them with physicians, so there's always this dialogue. Just as Dr. Spaulding was talking about the scientist and philosopher dialogue, in my case, there's the historian and physician dialogue. There's also Blood and Thunder, which is a magazine run entirely by medical students. It's Blood and Thunder, Musings on the Art of Medicine, contains literature, poetry, short stories, photography, artwork of the medical students, and takes submissions from everyone. So you can apply, and if you have a poem or something that you think is medically related.
We have Dr. Lisa Helmuth Margulis, an associate professor in the Department of Music at the University of Arkansas and director of the university's Music Cognition Lab. Dr. Margulis' research uses principles of cognitive science to investigate the connection between musical structure and listener engagement, especially in listeners without formal training. Her book, On Repeat, How Music Plays the Mind, was published in 2013 by Oxford University Press, and explains once and for all why you can't get that Daft Punk song about getting lucky out of your head since the Grammys. I got it in my head just from writing this. I didn't even hear it. I just thought about it to type this. Yeah, right. Her past work has appeared in the journals Music Perception, Journal of Music Theory, Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, Music Theory Spectrum, Frontiers in Psychology, Computer Music Journal, Psychology of Music, Journal of New Music Research, Empirical Studies of the Arts, and others, as well as in the recently published Handbook of Music and Emotion. Today she'll be telling us about a case study for thinking about science and the humanities.
So I have a bit of a history of personal incorrigibility. I'd like to come into my talk by confessing to you about it. So I started off as an undergraduate at the Peabody Conservatory of Music. I wanted to be a pianist. All I did was play the piano. And it turns out, think thoughts and have questions about music and about the way I heard music that I didn't really have an outlet for answering. My piano teacher knew about this proclivity, and she expressly forbade me from getting on the bus and going over to Johns Hopkins and taking any academic classes. Naturally, that only increased the attraction, and I behaved well my freshman year, but by sophomore year, I was on that bus sneaking off to take a class with Paul Smolensky called Minds, Brains, and Computers. And it was during my very second class period in that section that I understood that the kinds of questions that really excited me we're not answerable by staying only in one kind of institution or in one kind of discipline. And what I thought I'd do today is simply tell you about one of those pesky questions and the reason I felt compelled to go back and forth among so many different disciplines when trying to make sense of it. So if you think about the music that you listen to, lots of times that music features a lot of repetition. So think of the chorus in a song you might hear in the radio. But not only does the music feature lots of repetition, but also you go back and listen to it again and again and again. You'll claim you don't. If I ask you what you like to listen to, you'll say, oh, all kinds of music. But you lie. I know because I've looked at my own and other people's iTunes track play statistics, and we listen to the same Daft Punk song, 350 times. And this was intriguing to me. It seemed different than the ways we approach other kinds of aesthetic experiences and other experiences in our lives, and I wanted to understand more about it. All right, so let's listen to something that might drive some of these points home. You're simply going to, this is a illusion that was discovered by Diana Deutsch, who's a psychologist at the University of California at San Diego. We're first going to hear actually Diana Deutsch speaking, an utterance, and then we're going to hear a phrase from that repeated a number of times. Okay?
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely, 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 so strangely, so strangely, so strangely, so strangely.
Ready? We're going to hear now the original utterance again. I promise you I haven't done a thing. It's just the same thing.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible.
So for about 85% of people, it seems like Diana Deutsch has just entered a Disney musical, suddenly bust out into song. And interestingly, it's not that, you're thinking about it as more, song-like or something. It just seems like you are experiencing song. It's a pretty remarkable transformation. And I really think that what you can hear in this example is what it's like to attend musically, what it means to listen to something as music. So you're listening along predictively, you're listening with it. You're not kind of taking the information as it comes. You're actively participating in some virtual sense. And I think that this kind of comes back around and might inform some of the musical practices you see in ritual around the world. In my own lab, we were interested, given that there is a speech-to-song illusion, whether there could also be a song-to-song illusion. That is, could we take just random sequences of notes and get people to think that they were artistic and musical simply by presenting them to them on loop. And we found that indeed we could, and we did this by randomly presenting people melodies either in a looped condition or simply only once, and then later on asking them to rate the musicality of the passages that they'd heard. Also, in another experiment that I think nicely illustrates the incorrigibility that I was alluding to earlier, I took some examples of music from some of the most renowned contemporary composers, so people like Luciano Berio and Elliott Carter. And I wasn't interested in how the cognoscenti listened to these composers. I am interested in that, but that's a separate topic. Here I was interested in people who didn't have any special formal musical training. And what I did is I could either play them excerpts that were really from Berio and Carter, or I could play them excerpts that I'd sneakily digitally manipulated to add repetition. So I've just gone in and taken out little segments and reinserted them. so that there were elements that were repeating. And then I just simply asked people afterwards how much they enjoyed it, how interesting it was, and then most fun to me, or most incorrigible, how likely they thought it was that it had been crafted by a human artist versus randomly generated by a computer. And across the board, people thought they were more enjoyable, more interesting, and also had more of the handprint of human intent if repetition had been added brutally and stupidly by me to these, pieces that are members of the Western art canon.
At this point, we invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Kandel, to comment.
I'll make my comments about these 3 talks in relationship to my own experience. First, I'm going to work backwards. I'm going to begin with Elizabeth. And forgive me, I'm going to repeat some of the things we discussed briefly when I first met you. So 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege of having a wonderful dinner that included many acts, a wonderful pianist, and Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist. And they have performed together for 40 years. And they were just fantastic people, not only describing their interactions with each other, but they had read, amazingly enough, my book on art and science, and they wanted to know, why do people respond to music the way they do? I had not read Elizabeth's book, although I went out and rapidly bought it afterwards. But some of the things that she mentioned sort of intuitively came to me. And I'll put it in my own terms. I find that I get enormous pleasure out of the smallest ideas. When I put together 2 apparently obvious facts in a slightly new combination, if I rewrite a sentence in a somewhat different way, it gives me, almost obscene satisfaction. And I find that when I listen to music, the repetition is a discovery. I have recognized it, I see it again, and I love it. And it also moves me physically. I can feel lousy. I listen to Mozart, I feel better. When I hear Strauss waltz, the first thing I want to do is grab who's ever nearby, hopefully my wife, and dance with her. And have often turned to in moments of complete stupidity saying, I've got the wrong career. I really should have been a conductor. There's not a chance in the world I could do anything as a conductor. But it really moves me in such a powerful way. And I think this is terrific. The other thing which we have not discussed about music is that it's a conversation. So I think this is an absolutely wonderful area. And I think Elizabeth has really pioneered this and pointing out how fundamental repetition is to our life and how therapeutic it is. You speak to Alzheimer's patients, one of the things that gives them their greatest satisfaction is listening to music. And music, as you pointed out, affects our emotional structure of the brain in a very profound way. I also like the humanities. I like the point that Sarah made, how important the humanities are for medical education. Medical education is horrible. You have to really learn an enormous amount of facts, and these are not trivial facts. You're responsible for people's lives. But in the course of mastering these facts, you forget about the fact that you're dealing with human beings. You think about the results from the imaging that you did, you think about, the blood chemistries, you think about the urine analysis, but, there's a person there, a live person with a problem, which is very critical, and one tends to lose that. And I think the kinds of things that you emphasized are marvelous. The observational powers that physicians used to have because they didn't have anything else were critical, and that's now being lost. And to bring that back, and also to see the patient as a person and not as an object with the disease is absolutely fundamental. Now, it looks hilarious that we should teach people that people are human beings, but one tends to lose that in organic chemistry. I hated organic chemistry, I should tell you. The other thing, one has to give credit to psychoanalysis, which has a lot of weaknesses. But one thing Freud did was to teach us how to listen to people. A phenomenal contribution. If we learn nothing from Freud other than that, the insight that there are subtle, unconscious processes that are being communicated to you in the conversation that are extremely important. So I think introducing medical students to the humanities is great. I have difficulty with Dr. Spaulding's arguments. I hope you don't mind. This is an honest disagreement. And let me put this a little bit into historical context. How to begin? At the beginning, everything was philosophy. We had really no empirical science. We had no way of studying the human mind. We had no way of studying the universe. So everything was really done through thinking about it. And philosophy was the dominant intellectual force. With time, as empirical science developed, we began to have parallel, and in some ways more objective ways, of studying the universe. And the role of philosophy in those disciplines altered, and in some cases disappeared. In my area, psychiatry, thinking about the mind, philosophy was important for the longest time because there was no psychology. Psychology really came along and sort of in the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, even later, and really only became empirical with Ebbinghaus at the beginning of the 19th century and became powerful in the 20th century. And initially, it restricted itself in a very empirical fashion to classical conditioning, operant conditioning, rather limited aspects of the human mind. But with the emergence of cognitive psychology, the function for philosophy within neuroscience became more restricted. And if you look at the best philosophers of mind, people like Searle or Pat Churchland, they know a great deal about brain science. And I would say they're close to being brain scientists. So I think in order to be a philosopher that makes useful contributions to science, you have to be deeply involved in it. You have to really know it well. And